Welcome to The Stumbling Spirit, contemplations on the path of resilience. Whether you realize it or not, you are resilient. It's your birthright. As you take in your next breath, know this truth. It's not only about your capacity to overcome difficult situations, but it's about your courage to do the necessary work to heal, learn, grow, and move forward. What you gain is invaluable wisdom. And it's through these hard stumbles in life that we often discover a new purpose that aligns with our spirit. My name is Fabio da Silva Fernandez, Reiki Master, Mindfulness Coach, and Mystical Explorer. Join me weekly as the Stumbling Spirit podcast highlights the lives of extraordinary people like you, sharing transformative stories and beneficial practices of resilience to guide you on your wellness journey. They say that Homo sapiens emerged sometime between 300 and 200,000 years ago. One of the lead scientists in this field is award-winning geneticist Dr. Himla Soodyall, whose groundbreaking research has traced back some of the oldest DNA linking modern-day humans to our origins in Sub-Saharan Africa. Himla is here to talk about what DNA can teach us about our earliest ancestors and how understanding our genetic roots can help us today and in the future. It's a pleasure to welcome to the show Executive Officer at Academy of Science in South Africa, Research Professor in Human Genetics at University of the Witwatersrand, and author of A Walk in the Garden of Eden, Dr. Himla Soodyall. Hello, Himla.
Greetings. What an honor and a privilege to have an opportunity to chat with you.
I am privileged and honored to have you on the show. Thank you. First things first, I want to talk to you about the Science 20 Summit that took place in South Africa recently and that you attended. For my listeners, Science 20 or S20 is a G20 science and technology body comprised of scientists and policymakers from member nations from around the world to discuss and deliberate about some of the most pressing issues of our times. I must confess, Himla, I had no idea about S20 before you told me, so thank you. This year's theme was climate change and well-being. You're a geneticist. How does your subject matter expertise apply to the topic of climate change and well-being?
Well, the contextualizing of the Science 20 is an academy initiative. So it's the meeting of the academies niched within the G20 countries. And South Africa is hosts the presidency of the G20 this year. And when ASAP considered a whole suite of potential topics for discussion, we thought that climate change and well-being would be a good topic because it's of a global interest. And in South Africa at the moment, we are experiencing severe weather problems with flooding. My hometown of KwaZulu-Natal, the last 2 weeks has led to devastating climate effects of flooding and rivers being washed away, people's homes being brought down, etc. But then at the same time, we have elsewhere in the country experiences of drought. And then the heat wave. I mean, you all know that we've been experiencing at least between a 1 and 2 degree average change in the past year. So the cumulative effect of heat, flooding, and drought exacerbates the situations throughout the African continent. But we are not alone. The similar effect in Europe and South America, India, and elsewhere. So linking together climate change with well-being allows us to examine the way in which humans are affected, the way the ecosystem is affected, and the way the planet is affected. So delegates had an opportunity to discuss multiple types of activities niched within this broad range of a topic. So now the onus is on us as the lead academy to try to structure what we would want to put into a communique that will carry some recommendations. The ultimate goal of the Science 20 is for the academies to intersect with the policymakers in their respective countries to bring to their attention the way scientific-based thinking and knowledge can be utilized to advance policy making in respective countries and globally at the same time. So that's where we are right now. We had a very successful meeting with a lot of inspirational engagements. And now, ASSAF, the Academy of Science of South Africa, which I am the executive officer for, has to now start the process of working towards this document that I've talked about.
One of the implications, correct me if I'm wrong, one of the implications of climate change as well is disease. And this is an
Absolutely.
area of research and expertise that you have as well. So can you speak a
Yes.
little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I think the concept of One Health sums it very nicely. The zoonotic effects from, animals to humans, the way in which our plant environment is also intersected, but at the same time, various types of waterborne diseases are also linked with various effects that climate change brings about throughout the country. So a lot of these diseases could be parasite linked as well. And at the same time, in addition to the physical effects of disease, the mental effects on the psyche of people are also brought into that conversation. Because when humans are displaced because of climate change, etc., their entire way of life and the standards of living becomes affected. And a lot of these have either direct implications with well-being and health or indirect, those that you don't see, but those which are kind of internalized and can lead to mental insecurities and problems as well.
What is the hope of the communique at the end of the day?
It's kind of multifaceted. First and foremost, it's for scientists to have an opportunity to engage with policymakers and governments. But at the same time, we have an opportunity now to take science out of the ivory towers from the academies and the active scientists and to start communicating with the public at large. Since the COVID pandemic, there's a lot of mistrust, misinformation that is being spurned around within the wider public. So the Science 20, as well as other activities that we have within academies, gives us an opportunity to intersect and have conversations with the general public at large. So the primary goal is for us to use knowledge-based information to direct the sorts of policies and recommendations we would like policymakers to have, first and foremost, but secondarily, we want to communicate with the general public to show them the way in which science can shed light and illuminate some of the issues we are challenged with at a global level.
You mentioned displacement earlier as a result of climate change. Humans have been around for a very long time, so we have no doubt been displaced many times, and we have encountered many climate events over our entire existence on this planet. So I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts on how our human DNA, or understanding human DNA, in terms of how we've been able to adapt in these previous eras can be helpful.
Yes. Yes. So before I tackle the question of the DNA, you're absolutely right that our early ancestors would have moved and migrated because of changes in environment linked with access to food and subsistence modalities. So, for example, during the Ice Age, when ice covered the earth, it would have affected where people would have lived. And at that stage, our ancestors were hunters and gatherers. They were not yet quite sedentary. So they were moving around, hunting and gathering, particularly in the African context. We would have had these early ancestors, their descendants being the Khoi and the San, as we identify them in present day. But very early on, all of Homo sapiens subpopulations were hunters and gatherers. And they would have moved in search of food. So movement or migration at that stage was sparked for access to food. When we talk about displacement in the current context, it's displacement because we have much larger human populations in urban areas and in rural areas. People tend to build their homesteads around water, rivers, dams. When dams overflow and burst their walls, you get floodplains and so forth. So then you have people moving. Mudslides are also another problem. And in South Africa, if I was to speak from a South African perspective, there are a large proportion of our citizens that live in what we call informal settlements. And these are along rivers and in areas where, when there's a disaster with floods, they are the worst affected from it. So I just wanted to say that displacement and migration are somewhat different issues and are related to different symptoms for movement. But you hit the nail on the head in terms of how humans have adapted. Starting from the very beginning, when humans left Africa and from the tropics into the areas where the amount of sunlight changed as we went up in high, other latitudes, etc. One of the properties we as a species have is the property to adapt to environments. We adapt spontaneously, or other times, adaptation is channeled by a process that we have come to learn to be called selection. And one of the traits highly affected by selection is that of skin pigmentation. So when our early ancestors were living in the tropics in Africa, they were dark skinned, and the dark skin gave them protection from the extremities of the UV rays and the high intensity of UV micro wavelengths, etc. But as they left the tropics and moved to the north, into the Middle East and into Europe and Asia, the amount of sunlight changed. And there's another property that sunlight is required for, and that is to penetrate the skin to make vitamin D that happens within the dermis. So, in the absence of sunlight making its permeability into the dermis because of limited time zones of sunlight in these areas of extreme differences in climate compared to whence they've come from in Africa, skin lightening was one of the triggers adapted by a selective trait for skin lightening. And so that's how our human ancestors kind of evolved in order to make vitamin D to prevent them from dying from the extreme outcomes of rickets, which is the disease one gets when you do not have too much of vitamin D. So that's a very, expressive example of the way in which our ancestors have adapted to changing environments through a process of selection. Now, how do we know that selection is operating in this instance? Well, fortunately, we have some very clever scientists who can do some mathematically modeling, etc. And you do know that Charles Darwin was one of the people who advocated for selective advantages along our evolutionary pathways as well. But there are ways in which you can take data and test it for whether selection is operational or not. In normal circumstances, we say change can come about ad hoc or in a random way that happens purely by chance, or what we would say in an ad hoc way. But other times, change is driven by certain processes to respond to changes in the environment, etc. And we have learned from scientists who have been studying the selective advantage pigmentation that it is a process that happens very, very rapidly. And so that is a process that accounts for why we see variability in pigment, which is dependent on the kind of melanosomes that we have, which are the pigment carrying structures in our skin that gives us the different range or spectrum of color. Since this became a topical genetic type study, there are over 80 genes that I'm aware of that have been now linked with different types of practices of how it contributes to pigment spectrum in our species to date.
It's such a fascinating topic. And obviously, I hope that we're able to control the rate of climate change and stabilize it so that, we don't have to experience these drastic events that might impact our livelihood on this planet. But it's really fascinating to sort of get a genetic perspective of how we've been able to adapt since the beginning of our existence. I want to ask you just a really basic question. What do you do as a geneticist?
I kind of cut my teeth on human population genetics and evolution. So when I joined the Department of Human Genetics at the University of the Witwatersrand, my mentor and supervisor, Professor Trevor Jenkins, had from the late 60s into the 70s gotten involved in understanding the genetic affinities, the relationships of different populations in sub-Saharan Africa. And in those days, they were using blood group markers, your blood groups, serum proteins, etc. And over the years, he and other colleagues and other collaborators had established quite a good understanding of the interrelationships between the different linguistic groups in sub Saharan Africa, as well as the groups, if you were to categorize them by modes of subsistence. So, for example, if you refer to the San as hunter gatherers and the Khoi as pastoralists, and the people who spoke the Bantu languages as agriculturalists, then you could study the relationships between those demic units. And when I joined the department in 1986, the concept of DNA had just kind of hit South Africa's shores. We were about 10 years behind the rest of the world. And Professor Jenkins had recently returned from a meeting that he went to in the United States. And he heard Linda Vigilant, a geneticist who was working at a lab in Berkeley, talk about some of her research that she had done with Henry Harpending, who Trevor Jenkins had collaborated with in the Kalahari on the San community. And she was able to extract DNA from root hairs of San individuals and had, done some mitochondrial DNA work. And what came out of that research was almost leading up to the claim of the antiquity of the San community in the deepest branches of the human population trees when you were examining mitochondrial DNA. So Professor Jenkins heard this talk and he was really, really excited because they had worked on these same populations but doing blood group markers. And I had done a master's in biotechnology. So I'm one of the first 20 trained biotechnologists in South Africa. And so, having been equipped with that at a master's level and introduced to DNA a little bit more, Trevor Jenkins came to the lab one day and said, why can't we do this work? So that's what got me excited about human mitochondrial DNA variation. And I just wanted to add that from a population evolutionary perspective, mitochondrial DNA is a well sought after molecule for a number of reasons. The first being it is transmitted exclusively along the mother line. So all of us, girls and boys, inherit our mitochondria from our mother, and the mitochondria has its own DNA, which is transmitted from mother to children, but only daughters will pass it on. So, looking at mitochondrial DNA, we can study living people and try to connect the different patterns of variation to some point back in the past. The second thing is, unlike our chromosomal DNA, chromosomes numbers 1 to 22, that can recombine or exchange genetic elements at the time of cell division, in mitochondrial DNA, there's no exchange or no recombination taking place. So you now have a tool that you can study variation exclusively along maternal lineages and record the history of change over time. And change over time is what we call evolution. So mitochondrial DNA fell into favor with the work that came out of the Alan Wilson lab in Berkeley and later Doug Wallace's lab in Atlanta, with slightly different approaches to the understanding of it. So in the late 80s, I got excited about being in the cradle of humankind, having access to these material. And believe it or not, in the early days, they threw away the white blood cells that contained the DNA because the lab was mostly interested in red blood cells and serum proteins. So when you take a tube of blood and you spin it down, you separate the red blood cells, which are at the bottom, from the white blood cells, which are what we call the buffy coat at the intermedia, and it's separated from the plasma. So they were collecting the plasma, sucking out the white blood cells, and getting rid of it because at that stage they didn't have a need for white blood cells. DNA had not hit our shores. But after a while, we started separating out the material from plasma, white blood cells, and the red blood cells and preserving those. So when I joined Trevor's lab in 1986, one of the first things I did was an excursion to the freezers to collect the buffy coats, extract the DNA, and then we didn't use pure mitochondrial DNA. So I did what we call the indirect method. We extracted the total DNA that had the nuclear DNA as well as the mitochondria, separated those fragments onto nitrocellulose or nylon substrate, and then with a purely extracted mitochondrion DNA, we would affix a radioisotope to that and then mix it with the DNA on the blots and look at the patterns. That was called the low restriction enzyme method. Now, the Linda Vigilant lab was doing high extraction, where they started off doing placenta, using placenta as a source, extracting mitochondrial DNA out of that, labeling that with isotopes and running it on separating on a gel. But Linda Vigilant did sequencing. She brought into the spectrum the DNA sequencing technology. And today, that technology is advanced so far that we can even have whole genome sequenced pretty quickly and pretty cheaply. So for me as a scientist, it's been quite an excursion to have been involved at the coalface from low resolution of indirectly assessing mitochondrial patterns of variation to doing DNA sequencing of a hypervariable region to whole mitochondrial genome sequencing, and then a whole nuclear and total genome sequencing. So in the 40 years, my career has spanned the technological advancement in generating the data. And once you have the data, now you can do comparative analysis. You can ask a question and check to what extent you can assess the similarities and differences between and among populations, and how that tells us the story of the human journey, not just within Africa, but outside of Africa, and how humans subsequently to leaving the African continent, what was their trajectories in terms of evolution as well.
Was there a single breakthrough when you were working on this as a biotechnologist alongside Dr. Jenkins? Was there a single breakthrough that you had?
Well, we were actually playing catch up because the rest of the world were much ahead of us. So, what we did, and I didn't do this exclusively with Trevor Jenkins, when I got involved with the National Geographic Society and started to try to understand the patterns of variation in Africa, my sample base from Southern Africa, together with sampling from elsewhere in Africa, led to the calibration of the mitochondrial variation within the African continent. That allowed us further to examine the extent to which African populations had contributed to the patterns of genetic variability around the globe. By the time we came on board, people who were working on European populations had done a reasonably good job of understanding the architecture of, the patterns of variation in Europe. Doug Wallace's group and others did a sterling job in understanding the Americas. Other groups were studying patterns in Asia, into Australasia. But people had small samples from Africa because remember the Linda Vigilant study led to contributing to understanding of the out of Africa theory. But people had samples from pockets of places on the African continent, not throughout. So my research, my lab's contribution, both in collaboration with others, led to a much finer understanding of the patterns of variation within Africa or the Sub-Saharan African region and how those patterns have evolved and to what extent did migration and interrelationships of population contribute in the production of the patterns of variation we see today. But what I learned, and this is something I want to share, that genetics alone is not a subject that one should rely exclusively on when you are studying people, the anthropology of the human journey. And I was very fortunate that I was a scholar and I learned from my colleagues at the University of the Witwatersrand. We have specialists from paleontology, archaeology, linguistics, cultural history, oral traditions, etc. And so I was just lapping up the stories as you would hear it and read about it. And then when you understand the kind of confluences, the genetic trails not only leading out of Africa, but those that came into Africa, and the processes that contributed to those, led to a much finer understanding of some of the patterns of variation. So, for example, banana and poultry is not indigenous to Africa. It came from the East. There was trade routes within the wider Indian Ocean rim, all the way from China towards the east coast of Africa. There were trade routes along the east coast of Africa, from the Arabian Peninsula all the way to, the Limpopo River. And you would find glass beads in areas of the Kalahari that you didn't expect that this sort of cultural trajectory would go to. And then you learn it's a process of gifting. When people would meet with people, they will hand gifts. And so gifts can travel as a result of a social structure, but it may not necessarily mean that there's a concomitant genetic exchange at the same time. And at other times, you see evidence of genetic exchange, but mainly along, say, the male line. But what could influence that? So there are many processes, the process of the slave trade in Africa, enslavement, bringing, the foreigners into the land who were taking the slaves, sometimes leaving their genes on the continent, but leaving and going away. So this is what gave me the pleasure of working in this space because I had my tool, which was the pattern of genetic variation at the mitochondrial level for studying the influence of females to the gene pool on the continent. And then we did also the Y chromosome, which there's a region on the Y chromosome that doesn't exchange genes as well, the non-recombining part of the Y chromosome, that allowed us over the years as it developed from a very small scale area of refinement to a better way of understanding the patterns of variation, looking at how males through the use of the Y chromosome contributed to shaping the gene pool and how females contributed. And then we came to the point of using SNP technology with the autosomal, the nuclear DNA, to see to what extent is our story corroborated when we used, the total information from the genomes. So reconstructing history needs to be done in parallel with some of the assumptions with the genetic toolkit that you're using. So if I'm giving you a mitochondrial result, that's only a small component of your genetic blueprint. It doesn't tell you everything about you. why your nose is shaped the way it is, why your hair is straight or colored. Those genes are not encoded on the mitochondria. But the mitochondria has a purpose of making the energy that drives all the cellular processes. But it also has its own DNA, which we have utilized for reconstructing history. So the moral of the story is when you ask a question, you need to use a right tool in terms of the type of DNA and analysis to check to what extent you are contributing to the story. And when you put it all together, that's when the puzzle now reveals itself as a picture into the past, and it's an unbiased record. While I can change my clothes or the language I speak or the food I eat in one generation, I can't change what's in my genetics. And so that's the contribution of the genetics to the multifactorial way of asking questions into the past. And I've been fascinated with it from the day I was introduced to it by Trevor Jenkins. I've been so privileged to have had the opportunity to be able to get into the field, to learn the ethical protocol of engaging with humans and not just looking at a little vial of an invisible, liquid that has DNA. And that is why, to me, that vial of DNA is so rich with the history, the challenges of people, the communities. You started asking me questions about climate change and well being. And it's only when you are in the field and you are working with the people who volunteer to be part of your studies do you really understand that the sound bite of trying to achieve your scientific goals and ambition is part of a process of respect, knowledge generate, and learning from others. You don't know it all. And when I am in the field, I can't go with my sophisticated computers and PowerPoint presentations, but there's a tree out there that has leaves. And I would say your DNA will be deciphered by me in my laboratory as a leaf on this tree. And this leaf is connected to a twig, to a small branch, which ultimately goes to a bigger branch. And all these big branches converge to this common trunk. That's your journey. And with my toolkit, my process would allow me to identify which leaf you are on. And given all the work we've accumulated, I would be able to tell you your history as to how your leaf came to be positioned where it is. And it's a remarkable way of being able to engage because it's about telling stories, of getting down to the level of the communities among whom you work with. And at the same time, they share with you their oral histories and their narratives as has been passed down to them by their parents, grandparents, and ancestors before. So it's been such a splendid journey of gathering information, deciphering data, and putting it all together, but in a engaging sort of way. And I think that's the way I've enjoyed the successes of my journey thus far.
I really like how you mentioned about the ethics of your work and the considerations, the social considerations, and other factors that you need to take into account when you're doing your genetic research. I think it would be fair to say that you're a national treasure in South Africa. In fact, you were recognized as a living treasure by the Department of Education in 1994. You received the President's Award from South Africa's National Research Foundation in 1999, and you were awarded the Order of Mapungubwe by South African President Thabo Mbeki in 2005. These are high honors.
Yes, but the baseline is that I am where I am because I've been fortunate to have had the opportunity to work with human populations in Sub-Saharan Africa and in South Africa. And without them, I'm a nobody. So, and I just want to pay tribute to my training with Prof. Trevor Jenkins and another colleague who taught me fieldwork. And the fieldwork lessons I learned was not to rush, not to be a parachute scientist. And the thing I enjoyed most of all was when I did the work with the National Geographic Society and then through my research with the South African Medical Research Council, and I had grants awarded to me to do the work. I went back into the field to give individual results. I also developed a suite of comic strips as tools because as a kid growing up, when we got the newspaper, we didn't want to read the headlines. We all ran for the comic and we'd fight over that. So, the expertise of communicating information by way of art and soundbite information was something I learned from being a kid. And when you're dealing with this science, it's very out of the normal mode of individuals to understand DNA. And so it helps to picturize it so that you can say, well, here's a story. And then we just scope this entire narrative of how from a cheek swab you can extract DNA. You don't have to get the blood, and how you use the laboratory tools to get to the DNA and how you interpret that information. I call my product Root to Roots, ROUTE to ROOTS. And I've written about that and I use that as a catchy title. I often get invited by genealogical societies and archaeological societies to come and have a conversation. And we constantly learning from each other because genealogists study the history of births and deaths of people, going back in time. But you hit a cul-de-sac at a particular point. Whereas with the genetics, you can go as far back as your one lineage can be distinguished from its closest relative. And it's much deeper in time, as you said in the beginning, going back 200, 300,000 years. For example, what did humans eat 10,000 years ago? DNA alone is not going to tell you that, but the archaeological record would probably tell you that. If you had a site that was dated to 10,000 years, you'd be able to see what is in that timeline that is linked with subsistence. Were people eating grasses? Were they eating animals? And if they were, what were they eating? Were they eating cattle or were they eating springbok? So you can ask a question and use a toolkit to empower you to understand that. But if you were to say, well, what were people speaking about 20,000 years ago? Our linguistic toolkit doesn't take us that far back. So linguistics won't tell you that. DNA won't tell you that, nor with archaeology. So at 20,000 years, if you want to understand what language people were speaking, none of the modern tools would tell you that. Because language per se does not coalesce to more for accurate interpretations beyond 10, at most 12,000 years, the lower limit being around 8,000. So you'd say, well, I'm sorry, I really don't have a toolkit that resonates to that point back in the past. And even if we talk about when did humans speak, how did we evolve the architecture to have speech? Well, I'm speaking, but you are listening, and I'm sure our listeners will be listening. So speech vocality and auditory had to kind of co-evolve. And all of this is being interpreted in the brain. And so that's where looking at genetic studies to understand which genes were under the influence of selective advantage in the trajectory of us becoming human. And some of the genes linked with immunology for our better protection to microbes and others is high up. The development of the brain and some of the brain structural developments is also high up for being selected for. Speech and hearing, and this whole vocal box, the architecture of the voice box, the muscles, the cheeks, etc. And there's one mutation in the FOXP2 gene that separates us from our closest relatives of primates, the chimpanzee, in that speech thing. And it's a single base pair change. And other labs have been looking at speech defects in families to see where is the structural problem. And the FOXP2, it's a protein. Specialists have been studying all of this. And so what I'm saying is when you look at adaptation of our genetic architecture, we as a human Homo sapiens sapiens have been blessed with many attributes that allow us to adapt to the environments in which we are. And I often get asked, would it ever be possible for the entire human race to be eradicated? And I don't think that would be the case unless the entire planet is destructed in some way or the other, because there will be some pocket of a DNA that will be left in some place that's not hindered, that will propagate and allow for humans to squeeze through a bottleneck if we were to have had that restriction. And in fact, if you go back and you look at the records of the human past, at about between 70 to 90,000 years, the humans did squeeze through a bottleneck through which we have now, lost some genetic structure, but retain the rest in the living peoples today. And I'm proud to say that the oldest genomes are still found in the African continent. And the people living today who carry some of those ancient genetic structures are the San and the Khoi in the southern African region. And in fact, I think one of the samples that has the oldest signature, at least for mitochondrial DNA, is from my sample.
I want to talk about the koi and the sun in just a moment. I think it's really encouraging to hear you say that you don't think that humans are going to die off. I just think that's fascinating to hear from you because I feel like there's a lot of people out there right now in this day and age that are thinking, oh my goodness, what is going on in this world right now? We are not going to survive. So the fact that you said that from a scientific perspective is really encouraging to me. So thank you.
We will have shrinkages of populations. The population size can shrink, but I do not think that it would devastate every living human that we're unable to reproduce and create a new progeny. I don't believe that is ever possible unless the entire planet is blown up and devastated.
You mentioned earlier the Genographic project, and this was a project where you were the principal investigator. It was a 5 year global initiative that was backed by the National Geographic Society in partnership with IBM Corporation and the Waite Foundation. Can you talk to us a little bit about that project and its importance?
Yes, it was a project that was the brainchild of Spencer Wells, who was explorer in residence with National Geographic Society at the time. Spencer Wells is a very bright young lad. Well, at the time I first met him, that had worked with the late Cavalli Swatzer at Stanford as a postdoc. And you may recall there was a time when we had the Human Genome Project that was going on to sequence the entire human genome. And then Cavalli Swatzer and a few other scientists proposed the Human Genome Diversity Project. But that project kind of died in the cot because indigenous population groups raised a lot of flack against the continuation of this project because some people called it like a vampire project, that their blood samples will be taken and utilized incorrectly, etc. And I think a lot of all of this happened because we did not have proper ethical guidelines in place. Since the Human Genome Project, concomitant with that was a very big drive to start the ELSI project, the ethical, legal sorts of initiatives being taken into consideration. But the Human Genome Diversity Project kind of spun off at the same time. And because the scientists were requesting the contribution of indigenous populations around the globe, people like in Australia were unhappy, the Aborigines were unhappy, and elsewhere, the Amerindians in Americas were not happy. In Sub-Saharan Africa, because it wasn't as much popularized at the time here, there wasn't too much of an issue at the time, but subsequently it grew into an issue, and I'm very proud to say that the other success for my sustainability of doing what I've done is that I've worked with the San community through their San Council and the Khoi through their community drives as well. And whenever I've been called on to participate in activities, I've traveled at my own expense and gone and done it just to keep the relationships going. And also going back into the community and giving results and keeping them inspired about the developments of the project. So much so that when we had a science paper, it was in September, and I wrote to Science and said, would it be possible for you to publish the paper before the 24th of September? Because the 24th is Heritage Day celebration in South Africa. And I would like to use the opportunity to go to the Kalahari and speak to the communities to celebrate with them the impact of their contribution by being part of my study that resulted in us getting a very high impactful journal publication in Science. So we took them a copy of the paper, we unpacked it a little bit, and my student, who was now a postdoc at Uppsala, and her boss, Matthias Krings, came to South Africa, and we went into the Kalahari. Matthias Jacobson, and we shared the results with people. And it's these subtleties that give you the presence of being community inspired, showing respect that you just don't take, but you come back and to give. And what we can give is the writing or contributing to the writing of their history for their archival kind of information. And wherever I have worked, I've summarized the data and I've shared it with the community representatives. I've shared it with the municipalities in those areas. And what I have left to do, which is part of my swan song, is to develop tools to take to the museums in the vicinity of the areas where I've done the work to contribute to museum displays telling the story. But yes, so these are the kind of win-win scenarios that allows you to be able to work using the ethical protocol of community engagement of science. And without that community engagement, if you think you're a hotshot and you're just going to like bounce into an area, take the samples and go away, and some people have done that and left very bad legacies, even in areas where we have worked. But that's not how I want to be recognized as a scientist, because I'd rather make sure I go through the proper protocols of going through the front door rather than jumping from a side window. And that's what the San community said to me. If Professor Soodyall can come through the front door, apply for a permit, and engage with us about her research, why should somebody take her data? They're very anti secondary use of data. Take her data and just utilize it without coming to us and telling us that this is what we wanted to do. So for the science paper and subsequent papers, we've created a little working group that includes the San Council, so that if people want to access the data, they fill a form, we review it together with the council representative, and when we all sign, then the scientists could have it. That's the only way they have allowed us to do that. And I'm the only person in the world that they've given permission to do whole genome sequencing on the material I've collected. So it comes with a lot of work, and not just doing it for the sake of ticking a box. If you know me, you know that I mean it from within, that this is the only way I will do the work. Otherwise, I might as well not do it. Let somebody else do it and get the fame and the glory for it. But I will never sell out the communities who have been right up there to support our research. First working with Trevor Jenkins, and then when he retired and I took over the population genetics research, that's the only way I have worked throughout.
I think it's amazing that you do your work from a place of ethics. And it sounds like it's very important for you to build trust with these communities who are effectively helping the research. They're helping the scientific research. And at the same time, you want to give back to them in the form of sharing that genetic information. And I think that's really admirable. Since you brought it up, I think that now is a really good time. Would you be able to share with us a little bit about the San people and the Khoi people?
Yes. So at some point, both the San and the Khoi seem to have come from the same sort of ancestral population. And that would be over 10, 15,000 years ago. So the way in which we identify people in modern context is through their self-identity, being referred to as San or Khoi. And in some cases, people in South Africa, we, made reference to people as colored, which was part of the classification in the old South Africa during apartheid. But essentially, the San and the Khoi, in my interpretation of the data, would have evolved from a common stock. Those people who retained the hunter gathering lifestyle persisted to being referred to as San, and those who acquired cattle after the domestication of cattle in North Africa and then migrated further south. And you can plot, archaeologists have plotted, the spread of pastoralism throughout Africa. Those who acquired the cattle, etc., in South Africa became known as the Khoi. And in fact, there's a site that I have worked with in the Western Cape, in and around a place called Stilbaai or close to Mossel Bay, in the mountains, is where the original migration of pastoralists from Angola through Namibia into the Northern Cape and then eventually towards the Eastern Cape, but not quite into what we now call Eastern Cape in the South African context. And I had the privilege of working with communities from that area as well. And then, of course, the San communities retained being hunter gatherers for a much longer period. They were much more nomadic and they moved in little bands of communities. And over time, as conditions became difficult, the Kalahari is like semi desert to desert, depending on where you are. It's a very harsh environment. And then people reverted to other ways of being for subsistence modalities. Then they became acculturated into more modern society. So the gene pools have now been incorporated into many of the more endemic units that we find in cities, etc. But we still have pockets of areas where people still self identify as San, depending on the different groupings that they wish to be noted as. And then the Khoi people seem to have become much, much more admixed and acculturated into these modern societies. So, from a genetic perspective, it's been very exciting using the comparative of mitochondria, the mother side of the trajectory of heritage, and the Y chromosome to see how have males contributed to the shaping of these communities. And so you now get to understand some of the processes that have contributed to it. Then during the transition from the 94, from the apartheid to the new South Africa, lots of people assumed different identities because now politicians were going to them to vote and to get their identity documents, etc. So people kind of, shifted identities. But with time, we now just passed our 30 years of democracy. There's a kind of affiliation towards reclaiming one's identity. And you won't believe, while I was still at human genetics, how many community representatives would come to me and say they want to be genetically tested for their ancestry so that they could reclaim their heritage. Some would even go to the point of saying, well, they were told that my report or they would call it the certificate, would tell them whether they had Khoi and San heritage for land claims types of issues. Other people would come and say, well, if your genetics were to say that I have some African, indigenous African heritage, then I could apply for equity-related recognition. So politics obviously showed its ugly head, and one had to be very strategic in terms of what was the agenda behind all of this. But at the same time, I can say that, in fact, just yesterday somebody mentioned this to me, that I has been the guest of one of the Griqua kings, the community of Khoi descendants, at his dinner table. Of course, I kind of created a bit of havoc because being a vegetarian, these communities only want to eat meat. And so the best meat dishes were brought in front, but the king would not eat until me as a guest would eat. And I couldn't eat this food because it was not vegetarian. He refused to eat until somebody brought me some vegetarian food. And that was just an aside, some of the stories that go with your job description of what you have to do. But the most important thing was that the Griqua community wanted to reintroduce some genetic research, a historical perspective from genetics to understand their wider history so that the youth, the youngsters, could be brought closer together to keep them away from doing crime, taking drugs, or not being good citizens, but to use history and one's place in history as a means of bringing communities together, that cultural heritage coupled with genetics. That was the mandate that they wanted, to get out of it. From 30 years ago, not wanting to be part of research and these types of studies, to being sought after, to having a space at a table of a Griqua king, Adam Kok V, it makes a big change in the way in which you as a researcher are seen by the communities and what you could take into the communities. You can't answer all the questions, and that's where talking about the limitations of your science is equally important to share with communities what you can and what you can't do, rather than telling them lies. Oh, yes, I can do this and I can tell you this. No, that's not been part of my brief. As far as I understand my science, with the tools that I'm, familiar with, that's what I take to them, and then we share that sort of information, and we learn from each other. So that's the beauty of being a scientist in this era of doing this type of work.
To my listeners, what are your thoughts on our conversation? Feel free to share your thoughts and ideas. Just DM me on Instagram at The Stumbling Spirit. Himla, you mentioned apartheid, and you were born during the apartheid era in 1963. Did you ever view your work as a form of protest?
Never. I must say, I grew up in a home that was apolitical. When I was at university, and remember, I was at university from the 1980s, early 1980s, that was the height of the academic uprising. I wasn't even aware of what was going on in the university because I was diligent. I went to my lectures, and I went to the library, and then I went home. At home, my parents, my mother was a school teacher, my dad was a clerk that worked at a bakery. My dad was a person who read the newspaper every single day. But we didn't, with all the news, when we did get television in 1975 and we started to watch things, everything was censored. So I must confess, growing up, because of apartheid and living in separate areas, ensured that that was the case. My first university, University of Durban Westville, was a university for people of Indian descent. When I came to WITS, University of Witwatersrand, in 1986 to do the master's in biotechnology, and to apply for a permit to study there because that was a white university at the time. So we went through all of this. And I came up to Johannesburg. I had a problem finding a place to stay because I wanted to stay close to the university. The closest where Indians could stay is more than 35 kilometers out of town. And I didn't have a car and I didn't know how to do it. So I eventually stayed in Hillbrow, which was at the time considered a gray area. And I used to walk to the university. So my science and my passion for what I did fell into place without any forward thinking from the time I started university. I was keen when I saw the masters being offered at WITS. I had read a paper on how oil spillages were being treated by cloning and modification of microorganisms. So I was interested in recombinant DNA technology at the time, but I was never schooled in it. In fact, I have never been schooled in the field of genetics. Microbiology and biochemistry has been my background, and then the master's in biotechnology, and then human genetics as a PhD. And I did my postdoc in an anthropology department with Mark Stoneking. I always say to people, you need to be fluid in terms of what you want to achieve academically. And what you don't know, you must have the courage to want to learn it. And that's where I come from. Everything I've learned has been self-taught with the compassion of people that I have engaged with to hold my hand and walk me through these protocols. And at the end of the day, when I found my niche in Travis Jenkins' lab doing the mitochondrial DNA work, and then the stories, the ethics, and then I found that space of merging ethical protocol, respect, and working with people. And I think instead of calling myself a geneticist, I prefer to be called a molecular anthropologist because that's what I do. I use genetic tools of molecular biology to study people. And my first exposure to hardcore politics in South Africa was when I was at Penn State as a Share Fellow. And it was awarded to people of color, as they call it, from Wits University, University of Cape Town, and University of Western Cape in a rotatory basis. And in August of 1990, I was awarded that fellowship and I went to Penn State. Now remember, 1990 is still apartheid. And so when I got to Penn State, I was treated with a lot of respect. I went to see Henry Harpending, who was at Penn State, who introduced me to Mark Stoneking. And then I got introduced to the entire institute. The first molecular evolutionary genetic institute was at Penn State, with the head being the doyen of theoretical population genetics, Masatoshi Nei. You can imagine, I felt like a kid in a candy store. Everywhere I looked, there are people writing papers in Nature and Science and doing this hardcore work. And at that time, South Africa was under the embargo of sanctions. We did not even have the tools to do phylogenetic analysis, tree building from the data. And then I walk into Penn State. I went to do work in a biochemistry department on enzyme kinetics. And then I met the world of the anthropology and the institute. And I asked to stay on to work with Mark Stoneking, who was gracious enough to teach me the sequencing and whatever. And that did it for me. That allowed me to find my niche and my calling because at human genetics back at the lab, I was doing diagnostic testing for inherited disorders. This project was just an aside. My entire PhD was done part time and became part of the research work I did as being a medical scientist. So, yeah, my kind of trajectory fell into place based on being in the right place at the right time and ensuring that I worked very, very hard to achieve the goals that I set myself. And the catalyst in all of this was this unique mentorship relationship that I first developed with Trevor Jenkins, who treated me like his own daughter, and later with Mark Stoneking, who was a much quieter person, but who gave me opportunities in his laboratory. And I owe heartfelt gratitude to the both of them. They're very different personalities, but between them and my own personality, I helped develop the niche to grow my science. And I will be forever grateful for those opportunities. And the rest becomes history at the end of it. These awards you talk about is a culmination of trying to do the best that I can with the limited resources that were available to me throughout these trajectories. But every so often, there was a carrot that was dangled, and I was able to reach out for that carrot and utilize it to achieve the next step in the sequence that's brought me to where I am today.
A couple of years ago, I saw you on a panel discussion online, a recorded panel discussion that you did a couple of years ago, and it was called The Origins of Humans and Culture. And you said something
Mhm.
really interesting. You said that beneath the skin, we are all African. So as to say, from a genetic perspective. Can you elaborate
Correct.
on that point?
Yes, and coupled with that is this whole question on race and racism that comes into play. And so I often say to people, if you were just to close your eyes or to peel off the skin of the person that's sitting next to you, and you look beyond that, we're the same in terms of muscular architecture, except for me, I have more fat around mine. But what I'm trying to say is our skeleton, our connective tissue, our blood vessels, our neural networks, etc. We so similar with all of that. But when you put on the skin and you look at hair, these kind of phenotypic descriptions of humans, then suddenly we bring in this racist mindset that some of us have been growing up with. So when I say we are all Africans beneath the skin, if you were to look at the genetics, you know, the vast majority of the genetic commonality in the human species is within Africa. And only a small component is what has left Africa. And because of clonality and how people choose their mates and where they leave their genes, etc., then these branches, which would have been a few leaves, become bushier, more leaves in these geographic niches that we today have interpreted as being different races of human species, etc. But our genetics is all this predominantly the same. And so that is what I like to say. And I could not resist the temptation also when I did my welcoming address at the Science 20 meeting to say that I want to welcome you all home because you are literally less than 50 kilometers to the cradle of humankind here in Pretoria, and especially to all those who have been in exile and coming back home. So, again, the metaphor was that yes, our roots started in Africa. Some of us left Africa and have returned, my own being the same. I'm, fourth generation South African, but my genetic roots comes from somewhere in India. So I'm also an exile back in Africa, even though I was born here. But if you look at the genetic tree, part of my leaf is from a branch of a tree that evolved out of Africa, and now I'm back in. Which brings me to a question which is something that's very topical, and that is the issue of identity. How does one identify? In the context of this discussion, you introduced me as being a geneticist and, claiming that space in terms of what I did professionally. But you don't know much more about me. But as an identity, if you were to ask me, I may choose something outside of my professional attribute to identify. We talked about Homo sapiens. I could say, well, I feel I'm a member of the Homo sapiens sapien species. I could, if I want to be gender correct, I could say I'm a female. If I wanted to be cultural, I could say I'm a South African Indian. And if I'm me, and when I'm in Durban, nobody knows Himla Soodyall. I'm either Mrs. Soodyall's daughter, because my mother was a teacher and many people knew her, or I was Bullet's sister. My brother was very good at sport, and he was nicknamed Bullet. So when I'm with his friends and pals at university, I was Bullet's sister. And so, it's only now that I've developed my own kind of identity as a researcher. But as a kid growing up, I was nobody. So identity is very fluid, and we assume an identity given the context. But identity does not equal genetic ancestry. One of the messages I leave people with when I give talks of this nature is to say that identity does not equal genetic ancestry, because your genetic ancestry is accumulation of the various combinations of ancestors that have contributed to my gene pool. So let's just say 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great grandparents, and you double your ancestral heritage every generation beyond that. So if you want to say, 10 generations ago, 2 to the power 10 is the number of ancestors who could potentially have contributed to my genetic makeup. But at 10 generations back, they still own one mitochondrial lineage that I've inherited from my mother, from her mother before, and so on and so on and so on till you go back. So herein lies the difference. In terms of my genetic ancestry, 2 to the power 10 are the number of people who could potentially have contributed to my gene pool. 20 generations ago, you go 2 to the power 20, but still one mitochondrial ancestor, mothers, all the way back to 20 generations ago. Now, I cannot say that my mitochondrial DNA lineage is representative of my total genome, okay? Because that's not true. And so when I give people their reports and their results, I say, I cannot tell you your identity. I cannot claim that you are San or that you're a Zulu or that you're an Afrikaner because I'm only testing your mother's lineage. Your genetic ancestry is accumulation of all of this. And that is why the second message I leave people with is that there are no pure populations because we've had so many mixtures in our past. How can we claim to be a homogeneous population? Growing up in human genetics, we were taught that these are the homogeneous, these are the heterogeneous. At which point are you starting? At which point are you starting? Because we are not starting with a clonal lineage in the contemporary, in myself. I am a combination of many ancestors through my mother's line and my father's line that have contributed to me. So, how can I be a homogeneous group? So, lots of people and lots of geneticists fall for that trap and they want to study admixture from the point of homogeneous starting to work out admixture. Now, I know there's things called admixture mapping, etc., but then you have to assume that your starting population is already a Smarties box. It's a mixed colors of different combinations that you have. You don't have like just yellow Smarties or M&Ms in your box. There is no such population. So I take those little boxes into classrooms and say, right, shake it and just throw one out. Shake it and throw another one out and see how many colors come out. Shake it multiple times till you see. So the box is Africa. If you only took one out, that could be the first movement out of Africa. Shake it 2 or 3 times, that could represent the founding population that went out of Africa. So if you only have a yellow and a brown, that is what's contributed to everything outside of Africa. But the lovely, the blue, the green, and the pinks are still sitting in the African continent. And they are blending. It's not in isolation. So while our ancestors left Africa and evolved outside, within Africa, evolution was also taking place, giving rise to a lot more mixtures, if we were to use this color metaphor, within the continent itself. So these are the things that we need to touch base on because people seem to think, Europeans are completely homogeneous. Well, they may look similar, but when you start to understand the genetics, you're going to see a lot more partitioning of patterns of variation. But instead of coming from branches that stem from the trunk, they may be just like one little branch that's skidded off, and you're only going to get subsets of that branch. And so that is why I use the tree, and that is why I use these pictorial ways of looking at how we can understand how our genetics has assorted from living point of living to the past. That's the conversation of genetics. Paleontologists have bones and fragments of specimens that they try to put together from the past to reconstruct the present. So we're kind of working in opposite directions. But somewhere is an intersection where the true history will come out. And that is the beauty of doing this work in a multidisciplinary way and an interdisciplinary way. Because it's only when you share information and you converse about your discipline can we try to unpack the trajectories that led to the human journey.
It's no doubt that race is a social construct, and we have created inequality as a result of this perception of a division of people based on race. So it is a very real thing from that context, right? Because there's been a lot of oppression. I do
Yes.
want to touch upon something in relation to that. In the Q&A for that panel discussion that you had, there was something that came up around the potential of genetic research to be used to create more equality versus more inequality. Can you unpack that idea for us?
Yes. If I were to say the concept that you raised earlier, beneath the skin, we are all African, then we're already showing commonality of descent, that we come from the same stock. Come to my tree metaphor, we all from the same tree. So when we think of it in that way, then you may be from Europe or Australia, or I may be in South Africa, but we part of the same group of species, Homo sapiens sapiens. So in that way, we are equivalent. Inequality comes in at a power struggle based on some area where people feel that they are better than others. Of course, economy is one such trajectory. Okay, so we think of people who have less money as being poorer, and so you don't treat them with the same respect as somebody who's got a lot more money and lives in a much better house and drives a much better car. And in the classic example is you could have lots of money and you can travel in the first class on a plane, business class, or you could be in the cattle truck economy class where I travel, but you're still going to the same destination, right? And if that plane were to plunge, whether in first class, business class, or in economy, your fate is going to be the same. Your class of your seat is not going to change your outcome if a disaster were to happen. And similarly, it is just unfortunate that people who are better resourced than others think of themselves as being elite and more sophisticated, etc. And inequity is not only by skin color. If you look at the origins of racism, people in Egypt were already being racist, one group to the other. People in Europe were already being different to each other. A lot of the wars, historical wars, are among the same looking people, but something else precipitated the onset of those wars. And what could it be? Power struggles for land, power struggles for how you showed your status being higher than others. So it hasn't always been genetic or skin color. And that is another story that needs to be put into perspective. Similarly, in Africa, the incidences of where some groups have shown dominance to others who are much more subservient, and the directionality in which genes flowed then, where a male from a dominant group could get a female from a subservient group, but not vice versa. And you can see this in the ways in which male Y chromosomes flowing into a population and the way mitochondrial DNA is assimilated into those populations. So again, it doesn't necessarily have to be race. But unfortunately, the way it has played out in the global perspective has been that the lighter your skin, the more resourced you are, and you look down on others who are darker skinned. And that is so, so unfortunate. We all have the right to be treated with respect and dignity. If you have more money than me, well, good luck to you, because when you are deposited 6 feet under or incinerated, you're not taking any of that wealth with you.
So I wanted to go back on something that I think is a really key point. Can you talk about the importance of oral history in the work that you do?
Yeah, I think oral history gives the communities a sense of belonging because it's through the oral history that their cultural practices, etc., are passed from one generation to the other. And if you look at how we have learned about some of the anthropology of the groups that we work with, it's been the tradition of passing that knowledge from one generation to the next. Then the scientists, the cultural anthropologists, etc., go into the communities and they start to record these oral histories. But oral histories, unfortunately, can only hit a cul-de-sac much sooner at a point back in the past, because it's from the point of where we've started recording these histories that we have access to this as a product of the accumulation and recording of oral histories. But oral histories serve, in my opinion, a very, very good social thread. It brings people together. It links you closer to your grandparents and your great grandparents if you've had the good fortune to have had the opportunity to share that time with them. And so I think oral history is particularly important in building the chronology of the recording of past histories that we did not know beyond the written record. And the written record captures very much oral histories, because prior to that, we hit a zone where we are dependent on the interpretation of a particular toolkit. Now, a classic example is rock art painting from the San communities. And as you go through various places here, you look at the art, and in modern times we interpret it in particular ways. But how is it interpreted by the people who actually drew the art? So this comes from the oral history, the way in which people have recorded the stories passed on to them. And very often in San rock art, you see the depictions of a human form, but with like a eland head. And from the nostril, you may see blood trails or trails of blood, being connected. And this is when the people will get into a trance-like state and they feel that their body is transformed into an eland. And so eland is very, very rich in San oral history interpretations, etc. And there are other animal forms that have been brought into it. And modern scholars have tried to reconstruct this history built on the way in which they heard the stories from the elders who would have told these elders, they would have got it from their grandparents and so on. So, yes, so that is where the oral history goes. Unfortunately, in my family, oral history about where from India my family came never spilled down. 2 years ago was the first time I went to India for the Science 20 meeting that India hosted. And a lot of my friends from India that I met while I did my postdoc at Penn State were very keen to know what was my reaction when I set foot on the motherland. They said, while I was interested to going back to India for the first time in my life, it was as if I went to any other place for the first time. It did not strike me as, oh, I'm home, because my culture, my way of thinking is pretty much as a South African of an Indian origin. So I would like to know, just for the protocol, but what difference would it make in changing my life? India is not going to give me citizenship because I know where I come from in India. So yes, and I think all of us aspire, because in South Africa, unless you are a descendant of Khoi and San, you can't claim that this is your land. All of us have come from some migratory route. Even the people speaking Bantu languages came as a spread of that linguistic group maybe 1,500 odd years ago. Sea-born immigrants from Europe, etc., came as they used the Cape as a hotspot on the way to the east, and later established colonies in South Africa. Indians came as indentured laborers from 1860 onwards, and later those people who could pay their passage came paying their rights on ships, came via then Mozambique, or before they came through to the Gauteng or the Transvaal area. And, other groups, Chinese, Japanese people, all came by some way, flight or sea. So we are all part of that cocktail that whose genetic trail goes beyond the political boundaries of South Africa. So if anyone were to push me with a political question, you don't belong here. So I would say, how much time do you have? And how far back do you want me to take you on this journey? Remember, I'm a geneticist.
One of the things that you want to demonstrate is the value of science to the average person. Can you expand on that?
That's a brilliant, brilliant question. You know, every single one of us, in almost everything we do, we are linked with science, but we don't understand it, or we are unaware of it. It's, for example, if you're boiling an egg, boiling point is higher on the coast. You'll boil an egg faster here than you would do elsewhere. I'm just like a silly example. So we do things in our daily routines that is underpinned by some sort of scientific realm of information, but we don't know it, and so we just carry on as a practice. So for me, what I like to do is to talk about science in and around us. How do I plant seeds of coriander to make it grow faster? Some people say you must crush it a little bit and put it peripherally on the soil and whatever. If you put the whole seeds, it may take longer. How do we know this? By understanding germination and properties of seeds and what will speed up growing stuff. How much of water, what type of soil, all of these things are important. So some of us intuitively take it as lessons that we have learned or lessons from experience, etc. But then if you bring in the voice of science to try to explain it, then you are widening the scope of the knowledge. And if we can do this, we share our experiences. The way I cook something, you follow a recipe. Otherwise, somebody say, throw a little bit of this, throw a bit of this. So, but the scientific way is recording how many teaspoons, how many grams, or whatever the case is. That's a recipe. But our parents had no recipe books. They didn't have access to the internet, but they raised us cooking us the most delicious foods. Oh, I was at a brilliant, brilliant symposium on Monday from an agricultural perspective, and I'm not in that field. But to understand the process of taking a crop from farm to commercial is such an exact science. You got to understand how it all works. And in Africa and elsewhere in the world, you have the formal sector of production and the informal. Then you have the sector where women are the primary producers as opposed to men. So it's so complex and so intricate. But for me, understanding the processes, bringing in that learning, the interpretation of the scientific value, is an example to a novice how much value you add to your understanding if you bring in science. So without being obtuse, when I talk to people, I say, oh, wow, that's so exciting. How do you explain this to me? Explain it to me like I'm a 12-year-old. And then you give them the opportunity to share their insights. And then you say, wow, that's exactly how I do my work. This is my processing. So, if you were to contextualize thinking as in scientific ways for our day to day practices, we build that onion technology from what we know by just mere understanding of life experience, then a little bit more science, much more insightful. And that leads you to asking the next question and the next question. So the learning trajectory becomes so much deeper, your level of engagement and all of that. So to me, you bring in science not to show yourself as being in this box and others in another box, and then you talk about othering us versus them. It is about bringing it together in a nice conversation where you also put yourself as a person wanting information, a learner, not only a knowledge dispenser. And so that's how I would like to see science grow. And that's how I try to communicate what we do as scientists to everybody. And to make a long story short, nobody ever sees me as a scientist. They think I'm a comedian that masquerades as a scientist because I make everything fun. We joke, we tell stories. And of course, the center of all my conversations is food. So that just gravitates across the board.
We spent a lot of time talking about the importance of understanding our genetic past. So I'm wondering if you could explain why understanding that information is good for today and the future.
So genetic past is one thing, but understanding past history is another concept. And so I would like to contextualize the question in let's understand our past, but I'm bringing you the genetic heritage story. There are other pasts and histories recorded by other disciplines. Why is it that understanding the past is good? Because if we are conscious individuals and we dissect the past, we learn the good lessons, we understand the good, distinguish the good from the bad and the ugly. And as people who have a sense of thought and thinking as the property that makes us human, the capacity to think, bring in humanitarian qualities, then we shouldn't be repeating the woes of the bad and the ugly past. We should be meandering our life's journey and our intersectionality with others on a path of converging towards a path that makes us much, much better humanitarians. So, understanding and being able to distinguish in a way from lessons and experience of the past can help us live the present a little bit better and to propagate what we would like to see in the future. Starting with the story of climate change, we can devastate the environments and stuff now from bad practice. All it does is it jeopardizes that environment and the space for future generations to come. There was a time when humans did not contribute to the ice age, but we went through that spell of where the temperatures dropped. Humans did not contribute to the extinction of the dinosaurs, but that's part of the trajectory. Crocodiles survived, some bird species have survived, the cockroaches survived, but other things just died out. So we are vulnerable, even though I said I don't believe that humans could be made extinct in the time because we occupy such vast niches of the globe that unless you destroy the globe in its entirety and all the biodiversity, there will be some smithereens of these humans that would reproduce and create another species from this bottleneck. So, history is important because it teaches us lessons. It teaches us lessons where I believe, as conscientized individuals, we have the ability to distinguish good from bad and to learn from those lessons to enhance a better future for all. That's the swan song. But how many of us are conscientized in that way? How many of us look towards the betterment of humankind rather than focusing selfishly on the self. And that again is a human dynamic. It's part of our cultural evolution and may also be part and parcel of our selective advantages going forward. Why did Homo sapiens sapiens outlive Homo neanderthalis? Because maybe we had better selective powers to adapt, to fight, to do things for our survival, even though we may have exchanged genes and all of that. But, Neanderthals per se don't exist today because the planet is dominated by our species, Homo sapiens sapiens. So, competition, survival instincts, I think it's just basic instincts at the same time, while we try to live in an acculturated, more meaningful, sophisticated society. So there's both of those dynamics that are the power play. And if we can control that balance in some way, I believe we have a better chance of a better world and a better existence going forward.
What does resilience mean to you?
The power to overcome, the power or resources that we have to navigate around challenges that have the potential of being detrimental to us and harmful to us. So we could be resilient if we could overcome those powers that are within our control, then I believe we have the power to be more resilient, more adaptive, to deal with the threat or whatever issue is affecting your sustainability going forward.
One of the things that I'm exploring right now is this relationship between resilience and survival. And I feel like your area of expertise completely speaks to that. I'm wondering, given your work in studying human DNA and the earliest humans and all of that stuff, what are your thoughts on the dynamic between those two concepts?
Yeah, but there's a third or maybe fourth dimension that comes into display. And the fact is that we live in a world where there's very rigid rules and regulations and the things that we have to, in this law abiding kind of society. So, what I may utilize as a skill to overcome some challenge, to build on my resilience, may not be ethical, may not be part and parcel of our moral code of conduct. So, if we were to look at the same scenario, say in a game reserve, okay, I love watching Wild Earth, I love going on these virtual game drives, etc. And you see the space of a lion who needs to kill because that's his only mode, lions and all these predators, lions, leopards, cheetahs, wild dogs, all of the hyenas. Hyenas are more parasites, won't always kill. But a lion and a leopard needs to kill in order to get its food, to sustain itself and its progeny, etc. So there's a kind of a cascade of events of all the game in a game reserve that kind of work in a dynamic that we understand in that ecosystem. We as humans are bystanders in this. We have to stay in our vehicles and we watch and we learn. But I shouldn't be killing another human for my next meal. So that is where I say that resilience and survival is not a straightforward relationship because there are other issues in that cascade that come into being. Whether we as humans can decide how best we want to utilize what's within our realm to become resilient for survival and how we interpret the rules of engagement in the paradigm of a modern society in which we live. And I think that's the thrust, the missing link in that kind of relationship of resilience and survival. That we have evolved as societies with certain norms and cultural traits, etc., that our survival is a product of what works best at any given time. And for us to become resilient species, we need to understand what are the other pieces in that puzzle that's best suited to the survival. I don't think that there's a direct link with DNA, to say, well, if I have this DNA sequence, then I'm going to be much more, I have a resilience gene. It's a different trait to if you're growing a crop of wheat and you have a drought resistant trait, that if there's a drought, this gene that's now been adapted will give you better dynamic. I think that power of thinking and the consciousness of our species is another combination, another attribute that comes into the dynamics of the link of being resilient for better survival instincts and traits. So, yeah, that whole consciousness aspect comes into the scenario of thinking as well. And unfortunately, I'm not so well endowed in that concept of higher thinking at this stage to give you any better answers with respect to that.
What are your practices of resilience?
Live life as if today is my last day. Because as much as you want to plan, yes, I have to be forward thinking in my planning as a professional. As an individual, my collective resilience will be based on how do I want to live my life? What are my good, bads, and uglies? And how can I diminish my bad and uglies to elevate it to the good? And that's based on my interpretation of things in the bigger scheme of things. I want to be resilient to nasty people. I want to represent the lowest common denominator against the bullies of the world and the people that I encounter. And if I can do that, not only do I have my instinct of survival in that environment, but I believe I could contribute to others who may be less fortunate in having a voice like the voice I currently have through my professional standing within the academy and the linkages and associations that I have. Yeah, so I want to use the voice that I've been given in my professional world together with my value of compassion and passionate in, representing people without the voice so that we live a better life across the spectrum of the intersectionality of life. I must replicate that motto of life and living and respect and building as I would be doing in my professional life as well. So, yeah, I try to live my professional and personal life in alignment with the values I have set myself for how to engage with all sectors of communities I come into contact with.
Molecular anthropologist Dr. Himla Soodyall, thank you so much for coming on my show. It really means a lot. Thank you for sharing your insights and your wisdom and your research with us. It really means a lot.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and I really must applaud the research you've done in the background and for the engagement, because you've forced me to think beyond my comfort zone, and I think you've achieved that.
If you wish to contact Dr. Himla Soodyall about her research, you may do so via email, himla@assaf.org.za. Himla is spelled Himla. Thank you for listening to The Stumbling Spirit, Contemplations on the Path of Resilience. This is Fabio da Silva Fernandez. Join me again next week for another episode of transformative stories and beneficial practices to guide you on your wellness journey. If you wish, you can follow and DM me on Instagram at The Stumbling Spirit. Until next time, take a deep breath and another step forward on your path of resilience.